the summer of 1720, a single pirate ship sailed into the harbor of Trepassey Bay on the coast of Newfoundland. Inside that harbor sat 22 ships, 22 vessels, with a combined crew of approximately 1,200 sailors. Armed men, experienced men, men who had every reason to fight and every means to do so. Not one of them fired a single shot. Every captain on every one of those 22 ships watched the pirate vessel approach, watched it open fire on them with its cannons, watched its crew board vessel after vessel without resistance, and did nothing. Some of them cut their anchor cables and tried to flee. Their own crews mutinied rather than face the pirates. Sailors who had spent their careers at sea, who understood better than anyone what it meant to lose a ship, threw down their weapons, abandoned their posts, and surrendered to a crew that was outnumbered by more than 15 to 1. The man standing on the deck of that pirate ship was 38 years old. He had been a pirate for less than 2 years. He did not drink alcohol. He attended church services when he could. He enforced a strict code of discipline on his crew that included fixed hours for lights out and a prohibition on gambling. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, and what he did at Trepassey Bay was not even close to the most audacious thing he accomplished in his career. In 3 years and 8 months as a pirate captain, Bartholomew Roberts captured more than 400 ships. He terrorized the Atlantic from Newfoundland to Brazil to the west coast of Africa. He blockaded entire harbors. He hanged a colonial governor from his own yardarm. He designed a personal flag showing himself standing on 2 human skulls. He wrote a pirate code of conduct that anticipated the labor rights movements of 2 centuries later. He fought the most powerful naval empire in the world to a standstill for years. And on the morning of February 10th, 1722, a single piece of grape shot no larger than a coin struck him in the throat and ended everything. He was buried at sea, as he had requested, before the Royal Navy could board his ship and take his body. He left no grave, no monument, no confirmed portrait. He left only the record. 400 ships, 3 years. The most successful pirate in the documented history of the Golden Age of Piracy, by any measure that matters. This is the story of Black Bart Roberts. John Roberts was born on May 17th, 1682, in the village of Casnewydd, which translates from Welsh as Little Newcastle, in Pembrokeshire, on the southwestern coast of Wales. Pembrokeshire in the late 17th century was a maritime county. The sea was the economic center of life for most of its communities. Men went to sea young, worked the coastal trade routes, served in the merchant marine or the Royal Navy, and built their lives around the rhythms of Atlantic commerce. It was not a wealthy county, and it was not a place that offered many paths forward for a boy without family money or aristocratic connections. If you were born in Pembrokeshire in 1682 with nothing, the sea was what you had. Roberts went to sea around the age of 13. This was not unusual for the period. Boys as young as 10 or 11 were taken on as cabin boys or servants aboard merchant vessels, and by 13, a young man in a maritime community would already have had years of informal experience around boats and harbors. The specific details of Roberts's early career are lost. What is known is that he spent the next 2.5 decades working in the merchant service, rising through the ranks by skill and experience rather than by birth or patronage. By 1719, he was 36 years old and serving as third mate aboard a slave ship called the Princess. The Princess was operated by the Royal Africa Company, one of the largest and most powerful commercial enterprises in the British Empire. The Royal Africa Company held a monopoly on the British slave trade and operated a network of ships, forts, and trading posts along the west coast of Africa. The princess was engaged in exactly the work the company was built for. She was sailing the triangular trade route that connected Britain, West Africa, and the American colonies, carrying goods to Africa, enslaved people from Africa to the Americas, and colonial products back to Britain. Third mate on a slave ship was not a distinguished position, but it was a skilled one. Roberts was an experienced navigator. He understood celestial navigation, the mathematics of determining a ship's position from the angles of stars and the sun. This was a relatively rare and highly valued skill in the maritime world of the early 18th century. Good navigators were hard to find and even harder to replace. A ship without a competent navigator in the open ocean was a ship in serious danger. This skill would save his life, and it would put him on a path that changed the Atlantic world. In February 1719, the princess was anchored at the island of Anomabo, off the coast of present-day Ghana, when a pirate ship appeared in the harbor. The pirates were commanded by a Welsh captain named Howell Davis, a man who had a reputation for cunning and a particular preference for deception over brute force. Davis boarded the princess and took what he wanted, including some of her crew. Roberts was among those taken. Whether he went willingly or under compulsion is a question that historians have debated for 3 centuries. The official account, presented at the trials of his crew members after his death, claimed that Roberts was forced into piracy against his will. This was the standard legal defense for anyone who wanted to argue that they were not properly a pirate, but a victim of circumstance, and the courts knew it. The practical reality was more complicated. What is documented is that Howell Davis quickly realized that the man he had taken from the princess was an exceptional navigator, and that Davis, who was himself Welsh, discovered he could communicate privately with Roberts in Welsh, a language that none of the rest of the multinational crew could understand. This gave the 2 men a channel of communication that was effectively secret, and Davis used it to bring Roberts into his confidence. Roberts spent approximately 6 weeks aboard Davis's ship. In that 6 weeks, he went from reluctant captive to trusted crew member. Davis recognized genuine ability when he saw it, and Roberts, by whatever calculation he made about his own circumstances and his own future, decided to commit. He would not get the chance to fully test his commitment under Davis's command. On May 19, 1719, Howell Davis was killed in an ambush at the Portuguese island of Principe off the coast of West Africa. Davis had sailed into Principe's harbor flying false colors, British man-of-war flags, and had convinced the Portuguese governor that he commanded a Royal Navy vessel hunting pirates. The deception worked, and Davis was received as a guest, but the Portuguese eventually grew suspicious, and when Davis walked into what he thought was a meeting, it was a trap. He was shot and killed. The crew of Davis's ship was now without a captain. They voted. The process by which pirate crews elected their captains was one of the genuine democratic innovations of the Golden Age of Piracy. Every man had a vote. The election was by majority. The result was binding. And the crew of the Royal Rover, Davis's ship, voted to elect the man who had been aboard for 6 weeks, the Welsh navigator they had taken from the princess. They elected Bartholomew Roberts. Roberts accepted. And then he did the first thing that told you exactly who he was and how he intended to operate. He turned the ship around and sailed back to Principe. He sailed back to the island where his captain had just been killed, where the Portuguese garrison was on alert, in the middle of the night, and attacked. His crew killed as many of the Portuguese as they could find, looted the settlement, and burned everything that could be burned. They took 2 ships from the harbor. This was not random violence. This was a specific and calculated message, delivered in the language that power understands. Howell Davis was dead. The men who had killed him were going to pay for it. And anyone watching from the shore of Principe that night, watching the fires and the chaos, understood that the man who had ordered this was not someone to be trifled with. Bartholomew Roberts had been captain for less than 48 hours. Roberts took his crew south to Brazil, where the real work began. The waters off the coast of Brazil were rich with maritime traffic. Portuguese merchant vessels, trading ships from various European nations, vessels involved in the colonial economy of South America, all of them moved through these waters on predictable routes at predictable times. For a pirate captain with good navigational knowledge and a fast ship, Brazil represented opportunity on a significant scale. Roberts spent weeks off the Brazilian coast, gathering intelligence and watching the shipping patterns before he made his move. When he moved decisively. He intercepted a Portuguese fleet of 42 ships that was anchored off the coast, guarded by 2 warships of 70 guns each. 42 merchant vessels, 2 armed escorts. The rational calculation for any pirate with a single ship and a crew of a few dozen men was to observe, note the location, and look for easier targets elsewhere. Roberts did not make the rational calculation. He sailed directly into the middle of the Portuguese fleet in the dark, came alongside one of the merchant vessels, and spoke quietly to her captain. He told the captain that if he made any noise or any signal, his ship would be sunk immediately. If he cooperated, his crew would be unharmed. The captain cooperated. Roberts took the ship, a vessel called the Sagrada Familia, and learned from her captain that one of the other ships in the fleet was carrying a particularly valuable cargo: gold, diamonds, and a golden cross set with diamonds intended as a present for the King of Portugal. Roberts transferred his crew to the Sagrada Familia, which was larger and better armed than his own vessel, and quietly sailed out of the Portuguese fleet with his prize before dawn. The total value of what he took from that single night's operation was estimated at approximately 40,000 gold moidores, the Portuguese currency of the period. The Diamond Cross alone was worth a fortune. It was the most profitable single pirate operation in the Caribbean Atlantic theater in years. Roberts was now wealthy. He was also, from this point forward, committed. There was no going back to the merchant service. There was no royal pardon that would erase what he had done in Brazil. He was a pirate captain with a fast ship, a loyal crew, and a proven ability to accomplish things that more cautious men would never attempt. But then Walter Kennedy almost destroyed everything. Kennedy was a member of Roberts's crew, a man who had been given command of the Royal Rover, while Roberts took the Sagrada Familia and some of his men to chase another target. When Roberts returned to where he had left Kennedy in the Royal Rover, neither the ship nor Kennedy was there. Kennedy had simply sailed away, taking the Royal Rover and everything aboard her, including all the plunder that Roberts's crew had accumulated. This was betrayal on the most fundamental level. It was also, in the economics of piracy, catastrophic. The plunder was gone. The ship was gone. The months of risk and work were gone. Roberts's response to this betrayal tells you something essential about who he was. He did not collapse. He did not turn back. He took the ship he had, renamed it the Fortune, and he sat down and wrote a code of conduct for his crew. The Articles of Bartholomew Roberts, sometimes called the Pirate Code, were a set of 11 rules that every man who sailed under his flag was required to sign. They were remarkable documents for their time, and they remain remarkable when read today. Every man had a vote in all important decisions. Every man had equal access to fresh provisions and drink seized in raids. The captain and the quartermaster each received 2 shares of any prize. Other officers received 1.5 shares. Every ordinary crew member received 1 full share. No one could take more than his share without punishment. Any man who deserted or abandoned the ship in battle would be put to death or marooned. No fighting among crew members was permitted on the ship. All disputes were to be settled on shore with swords and pistols. Any man who lost a limb in service would receive a specific compensation from the common fund. 800 pieces of 8 for a right arm, 800 for a left arm, 600 for a right leg, 500 for a left leg, 100 for an eye. This last provision was essentially a disability insurance scheme, a working compensation system for men injured in the line of duty, 400 years before most governments would consider such a thing their responsibility. No women were to be brought aboard the ship. Lights and candles were to be extinguished by 8 o'clock in the evening. Music could be played on the Sabbath only. Every man was to keep his personal weapons clean and fit for service. Roberts distributed these articles and required every man to sign them. Those who refused could leave. Those who signed were bound by them, and Roberts enforced them with consistency and without favoritism. This was how he built the most effective pirate crew in the Atlantic. Not through terror, not through the kind of performative brutality that made Blackbeard famous, but through a system of rules that every man had agreed to and that every man could rely on. His crew knew exactly what they would receive for their service. They knew exactly what was expected of them. They knew that the captain operated under the same rules they did. In an era when the Royal Navy flogged sailors for minor infractions, when merchant captains had nearly absolute power over the men under their command, when the formal legal system offered working-class sailors essentially no protection against the abuses of their employers, Roberts offered something genuinely unusual. He offered fairness. Men joined him voluntarily, in large numbers. Some of them were pressed men from captured vessels who were given the choice to join or be put off in a boat. But many of them were sailors who had heard about his code and his methods, and who decided that the risk of piracy was worth the promise of being treated as a human being rather than as a replaceable piece of equipment. By the time Roberts reached Newfoundland in the summer of 1720, he had been operating for about a year and had accumulated a significant record of captures. But nothing in his career to that point prepared anyone for what happened at Trepassey Bay. Trepassey Bay is on the southern coast of Newfoundland, and in the summer fishing season of 1720, it was packed with vessels. 22 ships at anchor, representing the accumulated investment of merchants, fishing companies, and trading interests from multiple nations. 1,200 sailors. Roberts arrived with a single sloop, the Fortune, and a crew of 60 men. He came in with his black flag flying and his cannons firing, making as much noise and presenting as aggressive an appearance as possible. And the 1,200 men in that harbor, faced with 60 pirates on a single small vessel, simply refused to fight. Some of the ships cut their anchor cables and tried to drift away. The crews on those ships mutinied rather than sail toward the pirates. Sailors who were unwilling to risk their lives for their employer's cargo took the only action available to them. Roberts burned most of the ships in Trepassey Bay. He took what he wanted from the others. He left with a brigantine that he then armed heavily and named the Royal Fortune, making her his new flagship, the Royal Fortune. Roberts would give this name to several successive ships throughout his career, always transferring it to whatever vessel was currently his most powerful command. The name was both a statement of identity and a practical marker. When sailors in the Caribbean and the Atlantic heard that the Royal Fortune was in their waters, they knew what it meant. They knew it meant Black Bart. From Newfoundland, Roberts turned south and returned to the Caribbean, and the pace and scale of his operations accelerated to a level that had no precedent in the history of Atlantic piracy. He swept through the islands of the Lesser Antilles, capturing ships off Barbados and Martinique. He captured a large French vessel and incorporated her into his fleet. He operated simultaneously with multiple ships, coordinating attacks across wide areas of ocean. He was everywhere and nowhere, appearing in places no one expected, disappearing before any organized response could be mounted. The colonial governors of the Caribbean were increasingly desperate. Trade was being disrupted on a massive scale. Insurance rates for Caribbean voyages were climbing to levels that threatened to make the trade uneconomic. The Royal Navy was being pressured to do something, but Roberts was difficult to find and even more difficult to engage. He moved fast, he planned carefully, and he was smart enough to avoid the situations that had ended other pirate careers. In October 1720, Roberts demonstrated the quality that his enemies found most difficult to deal with. His cruelty, when he chose to exercise it, was not random, it was purposeful. A group of Dutch captives fell into his hands. Roberts ordered his men to cut off their ears. Some were hanged. Others were used for target practice. This was not savagery for its own sake. It was a message, delivered in terms that the maritime world could not ignore, that the cost of resistance was going to be higher than any merchant or navy officer wanted to pay. But this cruelty existed alongside genuine complexity. Roberts did not torture for pleasure. He did not murder indiscriminately. Ships that surrendered quickly and cooperated were generally treated reasonably, their crews released, their captains sometimes given back their vessels after the most valuable cargo was taken. Roberts understood that his reputation was a weapon, and he managed it strategically. Terror when terror served the purpose. Fairness when fairness created the conditions he needed. He rarely drank alcohol. In a world where drunkenness among pirate crews was endemic and often contributed to disasters, Roberts maintained sobriety as a personal standard. He was said to prefer tea. This was not an affectation. It was a deliberate choice by a man who understood that clarity of mind was a tactical advantage. While other pirate crews drank themselves insensible during celebrations, Roberts stayed sober and kept thinking. He held religious services on his ships. He respected the Sabbath, at least in the specific sense of not requiring his musicians to play on Sundays without consent. He had a sense of personal dignity and style that expressed itself in his dress, which was reportedly elaborate and deliberate. Dark clothes, fine fabrics, a red feather in his hat. He wanted to look like what he was, a captain, a man of consequence. These contradictions, the religious observance and the cut ears, the elaborate dress and the practical sobriety, the democratic code and the swift, brutal punishment, are what make Roberts genuinely interesting, rather than simply a record holder in the ledger of maritime crime. He was not a simple man. He was not operating from a simple set of motivations. He had thought carefully about who he was and how he intended to operate, and the result was something genuinely unprecedented. In April 1721, Roberts did the thing that sealed his fate. He captured a French man of war, a large, well-armed warship, the kind of vessel that most pirate captains would have avoided carefully. Roberts took her, and in doing so, he took her most important passenger. The governor of the French colony of Martinique was aboard. Roberts hanged him from the yardarm. The yardarm is the horizontal spar that extends from the mast, the wooden beam from which sails are hung. Hanging a man from a yardarm meant hoisting him by a rope until he died, in full view of anyone watching from the sea or the shore. It was a public execution performed by a man who had no legal authority to execute anyone, against a representative of the French crown in waters that France considered its territory. The governor of Martinique was not the first official that Roberts had killed. He had already, at some earlier point in his Caribbean campaign, captured and killed the governor of Martinique's counterpart on the island of Barbados. This man had made the mistake of sending ships after Roberts, and Roberts had responded with characteristic directness. After the death of the Barbados governor, Roberts had designed a new personal flag. His flag showed a figure, representing himself, standing with his feet planted on two human skulls. Beneath each skull were letters ABH, AMH. The letters stood for a Barbadian's head and a Martinican's head. Roberts was flying, from the mast of his ship, a flag that explicitly commemorated his killing of two colonial governors. This was beyond provocation. This was a declaration that Roberts considered himself at war with the colonial powers of the Caribbean, and was willing to say so publicly, in the most visible and unmistakable way possible. The killing of the Martinique governor in April 1721 was the response. The French and British colonial authorities, who had been treating Roberts as a serious nuisance and a significant economic problem, now understood that they were dealing with something different. He was not going to stop. He was not going to negotiate. He was not going to accept a pardon or retreat to some remote island and count his money. He was going to keep going until someone stopped him. The Royal Navy began preparing a serious response. But before that response could be organized and executed, Roberts had time for one more campaign that demonstrated both his ambition and the unprecedented scale of what he had built. By the end of 1721, Roberts commanded not one ship, but a fleet. The Royal Fortune, his flagship, was a large frigate carrying 40 cannons and a crew of more than 200 men. He had a second ship, the Ranger, under its own captain. He had a third vessel, the Little Ranger. He was operating a coordinated fleet across a massive expanse of ocean. In January 1722, Roberts sailed into the harbor of Ouidah on the coast of present-day Benin in West Africa. Ouidah was one of the most important ports in the Atlantic slave trade, a place where enslaved people were loaded onto ships by the thousands for the crossing to the Americas. When Roberts sailed in with his black flags flying, 11 ships in the harbor immediately surrendered without a shot being fired. 11 ships, immediately, without resistance. Roberts took what he wanted and sailed away. Among the captives he freed during his West African operations were a number of enslaved Africans who joined his crew. By the time of his final battle, a significant portion of his crew were African men who had been freed from slave ships and who had chosen to sail under the black flag. This detail is one of the most striking and least discussed aspects of Roberts's career. The slave trade was the economic engine of the Atlantic world in 1722, and Roberts was operating in direct opposition to it in ways that were partly practical and partly something more than that. He raided slave ships. He freed the people in their holds. He incorporated them into his crew on the same terms as everyone else. one share of every prize, one vote on every important decision. Whether Roberts had any particular moral objection to slavery as an institution, or whether he was simply taking able-bodied men where he could find them, is impossible to know with certainty. What is documented is that when the HMS Swallow finally caught up with him and his crew was captured, 65 of the 272 prisoners taken were formerly enslaved Africans who had been with Roberts's fleet. They were not treated as freedmen by the British authorities. They were sold back into slavery. Captain Challoner Ogle of the HMS Swallow had been hunting Roberts for months when he finally found him at Cape Lopez off the coast of present-day Gabon on the morning of February 5, 1722. Roberts had 3 ships anchored in the bay: the Royal Fortune, the Ranger, and the Little Ranger. The crew had been celebrating. They had captured a ship called the Neptune the day before, and many of the men were in various states of drunkenness or exhaustion. Roberts himself, according to accounts given afterward by survivors, had been awake late and was not at his sharpest when the Swallow appeared. Ogle was smart. He did not immediately attack. Instead, he used the Swallow's appearance, a large naval vessel, to lure one of Roberts's ships out of the bay. The pirates on the Ranger saw the Swallow and thought it was a merchant vessel trying to escape. Captain James Skirm of the Ranger gave chase, which was exactly what Ogle wanted. Once the Ranger was out of sight of the other pirate ships in the harbor, the Swallow turned and engaged. The battle was fierce. 10 pirates were killed in the opening broadsides. A cannonball took off Skirm's leg below the knee. He refused to leave the deck and continued to command from where he stood until the Ranger was overwhelmed and forced to surrender. The Ranger was taken. Her surviving crew were put in irons. The Swallow then turned back toward Cape Lopez. On the Royal Fortune, Roberts knew something was wrong, or at least suspected it. A man aboard his ship, a deserter from the Royal Navy who recognized the Swallow's profile, told Roberts that the ship approaching was not the Ranger returning, but a warship. Roberts made the decision to fight his way out, rather than surrender. He dressed in his finest clothes. This detail has been recorded in the accounts of the battle, and it deserves attention, because it tells you something about who Bartholomew Roberts was in his final moments. He knew what was coming. He understood the odds. He put on his crimson damask waistcoat and breeches, his red feather, his weapons, his gold chain with its diamond cross, the same cross he had taken from the Portuguese fleet in Brazil 3 years earlier. He was going to meet whatever came next, looking like himself. The Swallow opened fire on the Royal Fortune. The pirates returned fire. For a period, the battle was genuinely contested. Roberts moved across the deck, directing his men, working to find an angle of attack or a line of escape. Then the grape shot found him. Grape shot was a cluster of small iron balls packed into a canvas bag that, when fired from a cannon, spread like a lethal shotgun blast across a wide area. One piece of grape shot, described in the accounts as no larger than a coin, struck Bartholomew Roberts in the throat. It severed his spinal column. He was dead before he hit the deck. He was 39 years old. His crew, following the instruction he had given them, threw his body overboard before the Swallow could board the Royal Fortune. He went into the Atlantic in his finest clothes, with the diamond cross around his neck, and the ocean took him. The Swallow boarded the Royal Fortune and found a crew in chaos, leaderless, many of them drunk, the fight gone out of them the moment their captain fell. They surrendered. The final accounting was this: the Royal Fortune was captured. The Ranger was captured. Of the 272 men taken prisoner, the majority were transported to Cape Coast Castle on the West African coast for trial. The trials were conducted by the Admiralty Court and lasted several weeks. 52 men were hanged. 37 were sentenced to terms of servitude in the Royal Africa Company's African operations. 17 were sent to the Marshalsea prison in England. 74 were acquitted. 65, the Africans who had sailed with Roberts, were sold back into slavery. James Skirm, who had lost his leg in the battle with the Swallow, but refused to leave the deck until his ship was taken, was among those hanged. He died as he had fought, without flinching. The death of Bartholomew Roberts and the subsequent destruction of his fleet had an effect on Atlantic piracy that was almost immediate and nearly total. Within a few years of his death, the Golden Age of Piracy was effectively over. The Royal Navy had become too powerful, the colonial authorities too organized, the political will to end piracy too strong. The gaps in authority that had made Caribbean piracy possible for decades were closing, and Roberts had been the last pirate powerful enough to keep them open by sheer force. He had not ended piracy deliberately. He had simply been so effective for so long that the powers arrayed against him had been forced to become better than they had been. And when they became better enough to beat him, they were also better enough to beat everyone else. To understand what Bartholomew Roberts actually achieved, you need to understand the numbers in their full context. 400 ships. This figure appears in every account of Roberts's career, and it is accurate in its general outline, with some historians placing the total even higher, at 470 or more. But the raw number does not capture what it meant. In the 3 years between 1719 and 1722, Roberts single-handedly disrupted Atlantic trade on a scale that forced multiple governments to change their policies and deploy significant military resources. Insurance rates for Caribbean and Atlantic voyages increased to the point where some trade routes became economically marginal. Merchant companies lobbied their governments with increasing desperation for naval protection. Colonial governors wrote increasingly frantic letters to London and Paris and Lisbon, describing the impossibility of maintaining normal commerce in the face of Roberts's operations. He had, effectively, declared economic war on the Atlantic trading system and come close to winning. Compare this to the pirates who are more famous. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, is probably the most recognizable name in Golden Age piracy. His career lasted approximately 2 years, from 1716 to 1718. In that time, he captured approximately 40 ships. His reputation for theatrical violence and the dramatic ending of his career, which involved a hand-to-hand battle in which he reportedly took 5 bullet wounds and multiple sword cuts before dying, have made him the iconic image of the Caribbean pirate. Roberts captured 10 times as many ships in twice as much time. His career was more consequential, his impact more lasting, and his methods more sophisticated. But he is less famous because his story does not end in the kind of dramatic, easily mythologized confrontation that Blackbeard's does. He died in a naval battle, quickly, wearing his best clothes, before his enemies could reach him. He was buried at sea, as he had requested. He left no body for the gibbets, no dramatic last words for the history books, no final standoff in a tavern or a lagoon that could be turned into a story. He left only the record, and the record is staggering. Consider the geography of his career. He operated off the coast of Newfoundland and in the waters of New England. He was active throughout the Caribbean, from Barbados to Martinique to the islands of the Lesser Antilles. He worked the coast of Brazil for months, He crossed the Atlantic and operated along the coast of West Africa, from the region of present-day Sierra Leone down to Gabon. He was, in the literal sense, an Atlantic pirate, a man who treated the entire ocean as his territory. No other pirate of his era came close to operating at this scale. Consider the sophistication of his operations. He did not rely on a single ship, but built a fleet. He coordinated attacks across multiple vessels. He gathered intelligence before striking, using the information extracted from captured sailors to understand the shipping patterns, the cargoes, the naval deployments of his hunting grounds. He planned. He thought ahead. He was, in the vocabulary of modern military strategy, a commander rather than simply a fighter. Consider the political intelligence of his flag designs. The skull and crossbones tradition associated with piracy owes a significant debt to Roberts, who personalized and politicized the Jolly Roger in ways that no one had before him. His flag, showing himself standing on the governor's skulls, was not just a threat. It was a political statement. It identified specific enemies. It told the colonial powers watching from shore that this man knew who he was fighting and why, and that he intended to continue fighting. Consider the genuine social innovation of his articles. The pirate code that Roberts wrote after Walter Kennedy's betrayal was not a unique document in the history of piracy. Other crews had articles. But Roberts's articles were more detailed, more thoughtful, and more consistently enforced than most. The disability compensation scheme in particular stands out as a genuine innovation in the treatment of working people. These were men who put their bodies at risk in their work, who could be maimed in the violence that was endemic to their trade, and Roberts had written into his code a specific financial protection for that eventuality. It did not transform the world. Pirates were criminals, and their operations caused real harm to real people. The ships they captured represented the livelihoods of merchant sailors who had done nothing wrong. The violence they employed was genuine violence, with genuine victims. There is no romantic version of what Roberts did that erases the people who suffered for it. But within the brutal reality of the Atlantic world of 1720, Roberts had built something that was, by the standards of its time and place, remarkably fair. And the men who sailed under him, who signed his articles and accepted his code, were men for whom fairness was not a luxury they had encountered often in their lives. There is one more dimension of Roberts's story that deserves serious attention, and it is the one that the standard accounts of his career tend to minimize or skip entirely. Bartholomew Roberts did not choose piracy. This fact is stated clearly in the historical record, and then usually passed over in favor of the more dramatic elements of his career. He was a third mate on a merchant vessel. He had spent more than 2 decades building a career in the legitimate maritime world. He was 36 years old, and presumably had plans for his remaining years that did not involve becoming the most wanted pirate in the Atlantic. Howell Davis took him against his will, or possibly with a degree of willing cooperation that Roberts later minimized for legal reasons. Either way, the point is that Roberts did not set out to be Black Bart. He became Black Bart because of a series of events that he did not fully control, and then, once he was committed, he committed completely. This trajectory, from reluctant conscript to the most effective pirate in the history of Golden Age piracy in less than 4 years, says something about Roberts's character that the mere recitation of his accomplishments does not capture. He was not a man who had spent his life preparing for piracy. He was a man who had spent his life becoming extremely good at seamanship and navigation, and when those skills were suddenly deployed in a different context, he applied them with the same seriousness and competence that he had brought to the merchant service. He was, in other words, good at his job, whatever his job happened to be. The job that history assigned him was piracy, and he was better at it than anyone else who ever tried it in the Atlantic Ocean during the Golden Age. 400 ships, 3 years, one piece of grape shot no larger than a coin. He died at sea as sailors die, quickly and completely, and the ocean received his body and kept it. His crew was hanged or sold back into slavery or imprisoned in England. The trade routes he had disrupted slowly recovered. The Royal Navy, which had been forced to take him seriously, directed the attention and the resources it had assembled against him toward the remaining pirates of the Atlantic and, within a few years, toward a world without significant Caribbean piracy. And Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful pirate in the history of the Golden Age, was buried in the Atlantic Ocean without a grave or a marker, and the current and the depth took him down to where history cannot follow. What remains is the record, and the record demands a reckoning. 400 ships. The number is repeated because it needs to be felt, not just counted. 400 ships means 400 crews of men who woke up one morning on what they expected to be an ordinary working day and found themselves looking at the Royal Fortune bearing down on them with her black flag flying. 400 separate moments of terror and submission and calculation. 400 captains who had to decide in real time whether to fight or surrender, and who mostly chose surrender because the name Bartholomew Roberts had already told them what resistance would cost. The power of that reputation, built ship by ship and year by year, was one of Roberts's most effective weapons. By 1721, he did not need to fight most of the ships he encountered. He needed only to appear. The flag, the ship, the name were enough. This is a kind of power that very few human beings in history have achieved. The power to move through a world in a specific way and have that world rearrange itself in response, not because of an army or a government or an inherited title, but because of a reputation built through competence and consistency and a willingness to do things that other people found unthinkable. He was not a good man in the conventional sense. He killed people. He maimed people. He hanged a colonial governor from a yardarm and flew a flag celebrating it. He disrupted commerce that hundreds of thousands of people depended on. He created conditions of fear and uncertainty across an enormous expanse of ocean for years. But he was, in the specific and limited sense of the word, extraordinary. He was someone who did something that no one had done before, and that no one has done since. At least, not in those waters, in that period, with those constraints. He was a Welsh sailor who spent his whole career working toward nothing in particular, was taken by pirates against his will at the age of 36, became captain of a pirate ship 6 weeks later, and in the 3.5 years that followed, changed the Atlantic world so fundamentally that the world had to change itself to stop him. On the morning of February 10th, 1722, as the HMS Swallow approached Cape Lopez and the men of the Royal Fortune scrambled to their battle stations, Bartholomew Roberts had time to do one thing before the fight began. He put on his best clothes. He was wearing them when the grape shot found him. He was wearing them when his crew carried him to the rail and put him over the side. He went into the Atlantic in his crimson waistcoat and his fine breeches and his red feather, with the diamond cross from the King of Portugal around his neck, looking exactly like himself. The most successful pirate in the history of the Golden Age of Piracy, the last man who made the Atlantic genuinely dangerous for everyone who sailed it. Black Bart Roberts. Gone into the deep water before anyone could take him. Still there.